Good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's hearing. Today we're going to hear more closing statements in relation to Module 6 from various core participants. The first statement we're going to hear is going to be made on behalf of the Mayor of London by Ms. Studd, who I'm pleased to say is able to be with us in person. So, Ms. Studd, would you like to come up to the lectern and make your statement? Thank you.
Demonstrates in plain sight the catastrophic consequences of the failure to have in place a robust system for the monitoring and amendment of building regulation and guidance in relation to fire safety. It has also revealed a shockingly lacklustre attitude to coroner's recommendations insofar as they required action by government departments. The evidence heard by the inquiry about the system of testing, accreditation of testing organisations, building control regulations and guidance, and the workings of the central government departments has illustrated a succession of missed opportunities, each one of which could have avoided the terrible tragedy at Grenfell Tower. The unfortunate comment in the email from Brian Martin that, and I quote, "we only have a duty to respond to the coroner, not kiss her backside," illustrates what must be a widespread public concern that lessons are not being learned from coronial inquests in relation to the prevention of future deaths. It is also imperative that the recommendations made by this inquiry are prioritised, monitored and implemented to provide the bereaved survivors and residents, as well as the public at large, with the confidence that the safety issues that are highlighted by such inquiries will be acted upon and be enforceable. In his opening to this second part of Module 6, the Mayor acknowledged that save in the most exceptional circumstances, the machinery of government works less quickly than we all would like. He appreciates that very often there is, of course, a bigger picture to consider. However, what the evidence has revealed in this module is a process that fell significantly short of an acceptable standard. In his closing submission, the Mayor wants to focus on 4 issues. First, the lack of rigour from testing and ineffective certification bodies. Second, the drive for deregulation. Third, the low priority given to building safety. And fourth, the failures to address the recommendations made by the coroner as a result of the Lakanal House fire. I turn first to deal with the rigour of testing and the ineffective certification bodies. What became clear from the evidence heard by the inquiry, if it was not already obvious, is that safety testing and certification is of no benefit unless it is conducted in an open, independent and transparent way. As we've seen in this inquiry, failure to conduct it in this way permits a false sense of security to permeate, with very dangerous consequences. The evidence heard in the course of this module from the Building Research Establishment, the United Kingdom Accreditation Service and the National House Building Council points to an industry that was aware of the dangers of aluminium composite material panels with a polyethylene core in buildings over 18 metres from at least 2001, reinforced by the fire at the Edge in 2005. In spite of that knowledge, raising as it did the obvious risk of mass casualties in the event of a fire and the significant risk to public safety, it was never spelled out in terms to government, even though Brian Martin had been previously employed by the BRE. Although not directly responsible for the cladding at Grenfell Tower, the NHBC relied upon the BBA certificate, which certified Kingspan 15 as suitable for buildings over 18 metres. Notwithstanding the obvious conflict with paragraph 12.7 of approved document B, it continued acting within the comfort and boundaries of the certificate, because the certificate came from an accredited body that was well recognised. In answer to questions, Diane Marshall Operations Director at the NHBC, defended the position of the NHBC, saying that it was within the view within the industry that a BBA certificate could be held in that regard where, as long as you followed the conditions of the certificate, you satisfied the requirements of the building regulations. As you so aptly put it, Mr. Chairman, this was a slavish following of a piece of paper. This misguided approach relied upon an untested assumption that the manufacture was driven by safety and not by profit. As you pointed out, the NHBC approach was based upon a philosophy that it was safe if Kingspan told you it was safe. How can the position have arisen where John Lewis from the NHBC, a fire engineer by profession, can tell the inquiry, I did have a lot of concerns about it, yes, but you're asking a fire engineer whether, they would prefer not to use combustible materials. It's like asking turkeys to vote for Christmas. What a perverse position had been reached, where the very people who should have been giving that transparent and independent advice on fire safety felt that their opinions might be considered so partisan that they did not consider it appropriate to express them. The BRE, responsible for and contracted to government for the investigation of real fires, was privatised in 1997 and found itself in a post-privatisation position where the government funding had cut them to the bone. Before this inquiry, Debbie Smith, referred to by another as the god of fire in the UK, defended the BRE approach and observed that the BRE had always done work for the public good. But, she told you, you still have to earn money, otherwise you're not there, you cease to exist. Its purpose, up until it changed in 2012, was to advise government if the building regulations or guidance needed to change. Post-2012, there was an express requirement for the BRE not to make any policy recommendations. This serves to illustrate the low priority being given to fire safety by government. The evidence from the BRE and government officials in relation to the 2001 testing of the ACM panels with PE core, where the flames rapidly exceeded the height of the testing rig, was shocking to all who heard and saw it. It's hard to imagine just how difficult that evidence must have been for the bereaved survivors and residents. It was clear to the BRE that the ACM with PE core failed spectacularly, and yet the product still satisfied the Class 0 classification because of the flawed approach taken to the significance of the internal core. The BRE had first-hand knowledge that ACM with PE filler burnt catastrophically, and yet failed to advise the government that as a matter of priority, the ADB needed to be amended to highlight the danger revealed by the testing. It was their role to provide such advice. At the time, Brian Martin was employed by the BRE and had worked on the testing programme. He was also seconded to government 2 or 3 days a week to advise on the review of the building regulations guidance and on safety contained within the ADB. In its 2002 report, following on from the tests in 2001, the BRE failed to highlight the important life safety implications of the tests that they had conducted. It was the role of the BRE to present the data and make recommendations, and for government to act on them. And yet they failed to do more than to alert government to the fact, and I quote, "These issues may require further consideration." Such an approach fell well below the standard that the public should have expected, and compromised the safety of the built environment, putting lives at risk. That those test results remained out of the public domain until this inquiry obtained them as part of its investigation shows a worrying lack of independence and transparency, which put lives at risk and has to change. The bereaved survivors and residents may have some justification to ask themselves the same question asked by counsel to the inquiry of Brian Martin, which was, given that the test resulted in catastrophic full-scale failure, the recommendation doesn't spell out in clear terms to government that if they don't review Class 0, people might die. And what we all want to know is why. They may also question whether a different recommendation could have saved the Grenville Tower from being clad in the same material and ultimately have saved the lives of those who perished in June 2017. The drive for deregulation. Whatever the political expedience of deregulation, it clearly impeded the amendment of ADB to make it fit for purpose and to drive up safety standards. The evidence that the inquiry has heard shows a preoccupation with 1 in, 1 out, and then in 2013, 1 in, 2 out, and finally in 2016, 1 in, 3 out, which had the effect of civil servants becoming non-reactive. Anthony Bird and Richard Harrell both told you graphically about the effect that the deregulation agenda and declining resources had on them personally, but also on the ability of their department, responsible as it was for building policy, to function effectively. Fewer members of staff, more focus on how they should deregulate, as Anthony Bird told you, meant we couldn't necessarily, with the resources that we had, focus on the job in hand. And Richard Harrell told you that the policy was intended to make it difficult to introduce new regulation. The system that resulted was that any proposal to regulate required additional work, and any impetus to prioritise life safety regulation was lost. The lack of prioritisation of safety issues is illustrated by the fact that following his 2016 appointment and subsequent briefing, Gavin Barwell, the new Minister of State for Housing and Planning, remained unaware of the fire at Lakanal House or the coroner's 2013 recommendations. He accepted that the housing supply agenda took priority during his time in the post. Any suggestion that the deregulation agenda did not apply to the building regulations or ADB, as put forward by Lord Pickles, was certainly not as it was understood by those dealing with the issues within the DCLG. His evidence to the inquiry was unsatisfactory in many respects, and insofar as it differs from that of his officials, it should be rejected. The lowering of priority in favour of the housing supply agenda also left fire safety matters in the hands of a single civil servant, Brian Martin, with all the responsibility falling on his shoulders with disastrous results. Any system which places responsibility for such crucial matters with a single person is clearly broken. This should have been obvious to the DCLG leadership, and the results for building safety were catastrophic. The effects of deregulation were compounded by the austerity cuts to government departments and the civil service over the same period. These concerns were substantiated by Melanie Dawes in the immediate aftermath of the fire when she commented in her email to the Cabinet Secretary on the 15th of June 2017, "At some point, we may need to reflect on the impact of cuts to the civil service. DCLG will be less than 50% of its 2010 size by 2020. On some of our deep expert policy functions, the expertise is still there, and it's excellent, but it's sparse and overloaded." Failure to act on warnings about fire safety. Certainly through the early years of the 2000s, the concerns being raised about ACM and PE cores were there for all to see. They came from the BRE testing, other fires in the United Kingdom and abroad, where external cladding had contributed, concerns raised by the industry, for example, the Centre of Windows and Cladding Technology, Nick Jenkins of Euroclad, and the all-party parliamentary group chaired by the late Sir David Amos MP. The DCLG, which could and should have taken the lead in remedying the misleading, confused and poorly written ADB, which Brian Martin acknowledged was in need of revision, seem too paralysed to do anything effective. The amendment of the ADB, which did occur in 2006, incorporated the reference to filler, but in fact led to a significant widespread confusion rather than clarification. Brian Martin, as the single point of contact, rejected the concerns being raised with him about the misunderstandings in the industry in relation to the term filler and about deaths and near deaths in cladding fires. The emails from others in the industry highlighted in the course of counsel to the inquiry's examination of Mr. Martin were dismissed as hyperbole, even when Brian Martin himself was aware of the shortcomings of the ADB and had evidence of widespread non-compliance. His failure to act illustrates systemic failures in the DCLG, the lack of political priority being placed on building safety, and a corresponding absence of oversight of this vital safety issue from more senior civil servants. By reason of some or all of the features that have been prevalent in this module, a lack of resources, ministerial disinterest, a lack of prioritisation on building safety, and an erroneous concentration of all building safety and fire matters in the hands of a single individual, there is a thread of jaded cynicism that runs through the evidence. Rather than trying to implement change and improvement, the DCLG was constricted by a lack of fresh thinking and an unhealthy malaise where the deep expertise of Brian Martin, which should have been helpful in relation to such a complex area, became, conversely, a hindrance to any progress. The failures to learn lessons from the Lakanal House fire is fundamental to the work of this inquiry. Core participants and the inquiry itself can urge reform, make recommendations, but unless compliance is enforced and enforceable, then nothing changes. 11 days after the Lakanal House fire, Brian Martin emailed the BRE his view that the fire did not warrant any changes to ADB. The BRE investigation was closed down so as not to duplicate resources, and the responsibility passed over to the Metropolitan Police Service and the London Fire Brigade. In fact, as it transpired, that initial conclusion was incorrect. Having heard the detailed evidence in the course of the Lakanal House inquest, including from Brian Martin, the coroner expressed the view that there was clear confusion around the interpretation of ADB and that it needed review. In spite of the Secretary of State Eric Pickles confirming that such a review would be undertaken, DCLG was apparently unable to take the recommendations forward. We have heard that they were hampered by frequent elections, the Brexit referendum, and deregulation. But perhaps just as significant was the complacency stemming from the initial conclusion that Lakanal House did not require amendment of ADB, the evidence that overall deaths occurring in fires were falling, and the fact that there was no historical evidence that such a tragedy like Grenfell Tower would occur in the UK. That placed unwarranted reliance upon the effective working of the building regulations and was, for that reason alone, unsustainable. However, of even more concern to the inquiry will be the inability or unwillingness of the DCLG to hear or act upon the concerns of the very many organisations which did see the problem and were aware of the significance of the Lakanal House recommendations from the coroner. The all-party parliamentary group repeatedly urged the government to proceed with a review of ADB and warned government of the problems in the built environment which were compromising safety. Individual experts, such as Sam Webb, who'd provided evidence in the Lakanal House inquest, reminded Brian Martin of the need to simplify ADB so that it was easily understood. Ron Dobson, the Commissioner of the London Fire Brigade, recommended writing to building owners to alert them to the contribution to fire risk made by cladding panels. And David Metcalf from the CWCT raised concerns about the misleading ADB wording. For each of those concerns, varied and wide-ranging as they were, there was an explanation as to why the rewording of the ADB should not take priority. Brian Martin accepted it was not getting the requisite attention from ministers that he thought it required. He confirmed in the course of his evidence that the government position was that committing more resources to fire protection or any other regulation was the opposite of where the government wanted to go. Louise Upton, who led the fire safety team at DCLG at the time of the Lakanal House fire, thought that a review of the legislation would be unwelcome, and to employ a competent person to carry out a risk assessment would question the whole rationale of the self-compliance regime. It appears that concentration on the deregulation policy obscured focus on what should have been the true priority, which was public safety. Consequently, the coroner's recommendations were allowed to remain unconsidered until after the Grenville Tower fire in 2017. The commissioned research, although held by DCLG in 2015, was not published until 2019. Having failed to act preemptively, the government then sought to cover its back when on the 16th of June 2017, 2 days after the fire, Brian Martin emailed Debbie Marshall about an article which had run in the Times, suggesting that building regulation guidance permitted the use of cladding used on the Grenville Tower. Brian Martin had been asked to rebut this, and he wanted Miss Marshall to help. He attached a script which explained the government's line on why the existing and unamended ADB guidance in fact banned the use of the material. As noted at the beginning of this submission, it is essential that recommendations made by coroners are prioritised, reviewed, and where valid, implemented. The Mayor repeats his support for a national oversight mechanism to ensure that recommendations from inquests and inquiries are systematically and independently followed up as proposed by the charity inquest. In his opening statement for this part of Module 6, the Mayor raised concerns about the fate of important recommendations to be made by this inquiry, given the government's track record in responding to the coroner's recommendations after the Lakanal House inquest. Regrettably, the government's tardiness in responding to the inquiry's Phase 1 recommendations indicates that the Mayor's concerns are justified. The inquiry's Phase 1 report was published in October 2019. In May 2022, the government published its fourth progress report on the implementation of the 15 recommendations given to government and building owners and managers. The previous progress report was published in September 2021. At the date of this submission, the government has not completed any of its Phase 1 recommendations. The government states that 9 of these recommendations are scheduled to be implemented with the laying of the Fire Safety England regulations on the 18th of May 2022. However, these regulations will not become law until the 8th of July 2022, and the new duties will not commence until the 23rd of January 2023. In contrast, the LFB have completed 26 of its 29 recommendations, and the Mayor, as part of his oversight responsible for the LFB, publishes regular progress reports on their implementation, with the 26th progress report published on the 31st of May 2022. Over 3 years will have elapsed from the date of the inquiry's Phase 1 report before any recommendation for government, building owners and managers are fully implemented. The Mayor is also dismayed at the government's response to the remainder of the 6 recommendations directed to the government, building owners and managers, some of which have been rejected outright. In particular, the inquiry recommended that the owner and managers of every high-rise residential building be required by law to prepare personal emergency evacuation plans for all residents whose ability to self-evacuate may be compromised. Further to a consultation which ran in June and July of last year, the government's response, published on the 18th of May, almost a year later, confirmed that this recommendation would not be implemented. The government has said that despite widespread support for the evacuation plans and the proposals outlined, there remain significant issues with the implementation of them with regard to proportionality, practicality and safety. Further time will now be wasted as the government embarks on another consultation on an alternative package of initiatives. The government's flat rejection of the inquiry's recommendation on PEEPs is astounding. At Grenville Tower, 41% of the disabled residents died. The urgency of the inquiry's recommendation on PEEPs is obvious, and the Mayor is deeply concerned that the government's attitude to implementation of the Phase 1 recommendations means that any Phase 2 recommendations made by the inquiry to government are unlikely to receive the priority and respect which they clearly deserve. Half a decade on from the devastating loss of 72 people, the way homes are built and managed should by now be totally transformed. We should today be living in a country where fire safety is prioritised and embedded. Rules and regulations are ambitious and rigorous. Guidance is clear and comprehensive, and the industry is responsible and highly skilled. While important steps have been taken, most notably with the Building Safety Act, we are still a long way from achieving this vision. And while we wait for long-lasting changes to be implemented, we have no assurance that the practices that led to Grenville are not continuing to this day. There is very little evidence of a culture change within the construction industry. There is real concern that the corner-cutting, buck-passing and rule-dodging continues. It is notable that as recently as January of this year, the Secretary of State for the DLUHC had to set out in terms the action he would take against developers in the event that they failed to take steps to make their buildings safe. This is indicative of an industry that is still being dragged to consider safety first. In too many cases, profit still appears to be the overriding priority. This module has demonstrated a litany of missed opportunities to raise awareness and standards and to prevent the catastrophe that is the Grenville Tower fire. The missed opportunities were many and varied. What is clear is that matters of public safety must always be prioritised, and the system of testing in this field must be independent and transparent. This will benefit the industry as well as the public. But perhaps most of all, the inquiry is going to have to achieve what Lakanal House coroner was unable to achieve, a mechanism whereby its recommendations are not belittled and filed away, to be resurrected on an occasion in the future where another tragedy of whatever kind has resulted in loss of life and livelihood on a scale similar to that of the Grenville Tower fire. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Ms. Studd. The next closing statement is going to be made on behalf of Arconic by Mr. Stephen Hockman, Queen's Counsel, and Mr. Hockman, not being able to be here this morning, is going to make his statement remotely. So I'm just going to see if Mr. Hockman is there. Well, he's not at the moment, but I think if we wait a moment, he'll appear very soon.
I don't know if you can hear me, sir, but I am here.
Good morning, Mr. Hockman. Well, we can now see you, and we can certainly hear you. I hope you can see and hear us.
Yes, thank you.
Good. Well, if you're ready to make your statement, we shall be pleased to hear it. So when you're ready, off you go.
Thank you very much. In this module, the inquiry has examined issues under four main headings, namely firefighting, testing and certification, fire risk assessment, and the role of central government. These oral submissions, like our written submissions already provided, will focus primarily on testing and certification and on the role of central government. In general terms, it can be said that these two topics both relate to the regulatory regime applicable at material times. This regime will clearly be relevant to the assessment by the inquiry of the acts and omissions of the various core participants which had or may have had some bearing on the Grenfell Tower fire. We do, however, wish to stress at the outset that for two separate reasons, the position of the company which we represent ought to be distinguished from the position of other core participants. The first reason is that the regulatory regime applied in general terms to those carrying out the refurbishment work at the tower and not to the supplier of a particular product, regardless of the extent to which that supplier had any detailed knowledge of the features of the work involved. The second reason is that as an overseas supplier, the company could not have had a fully detailed knowledge of the regime in any particular country in which its product might be used. Those involved domestically in carrying out the work would moreover be aware of these two matters and of the resulting distinct position of the company in relation to the refurbishment project. The inquiry will not, therefore, expect us to provide a comprehensive analysis of the regulatory regime or of its implications for the work which was carried out at Grenfell. The inquiry will doubtless seek more assistance on these matters from other core participants. What we seek to do is to assist the inquiry at this stage by identifying, as we did in our written closing, three key headings, namely, the sale and use of ACMPE generally, which will take me just about half of the time available to me. Secondly, the supply of ACMPE by AAP, by Arconic, the company that we represent. And thirdly, the supply and use of ACMPE and other products at Grenfell Tower. Of course, we appreciate that since the preparation of our written closing, the inquiry has heard evidence in Module 7, which may be considered to have some bearing on the case for this company. It's extremely tempting to embark at this stage upon an analysis of that evidence, but we are confident that to do so now would confuse rather than assist the inquiry, and that our analysis of that evidence ought to await the opportunity which we will have to address you specifically in connection with Module 7. The only observation I will make at this point is that there is a distinction to be drawn between factors leading to the start of the cladding fire and those leading to the spread of the fire, and the conclusions which one draws may not be identical in respect of those two aspects. So let me move, please, to my first main heading, the sale and use of ACMPE generally. With regard to this, it seems to us that the key issue must be the extent to which over the years prior to the Grenfell fire, it was acceptable, or at least not unusual, for such products to be specified. This may involve thinking about whether it was regarded as acceptable for combustible products generally to be specified. More particularly, it may involve thinking about whether it was regarded as acceptable for ACMPE to be specified. In turn, this may depend partly on whether the product was capable of being used in a manner which was compliant with regulatory regimes, or at least was perceived as being capable of being used in that way. It will be recollected that we have from the outset emphasised to the inquiry the importance of evaluating the conduct of core participants by reference to their knowledge and by reference to accepted practice at the relevant time, even if, where appropriate, the inquiry deems it necessary also to evaluate such practices from today's standpoint. The argument which we will be advancing is that ACMPE was in widespread use and was treated as being an acceptable form of rain screen cladding. Moreover, it was potentially compliant, or at the very least perceived as being compliant, with the relevant domestic regulatory regime. We suggest that the inquiry can take judicial notice of the fact that the use of combustible materials for the purposes of external wall construction has been commonplace for many centuries. Indeed, for substantial periods of history, timber was probably the only material which could in practical terms be used for this purpose. Moreover, the practice of using timber undoubtedly continues to this day, and in the course of his evidence in Module 5, Professor Torero discussed a 4-storey building which might be designed using timber as the structural material. He pointed out that the complexity of a timber building is much higher than the complexity of a steel building when it comes to fire, but that he could design both buildings to an equal level of safety as to probability and consequence, albeit that the designer of a timber building would have to be a top-notch engineer. It follows that we should not react with astonishment to the proposition that buildings can be designed using timber or other combustible materials, and that it was not until after the Grenfell Tower fire that there was any general limitation whereby materials were restricted to those which are either non-combustible or of limited combustibility. The inquiry has here been considering in particular an external wall construction involving essentially 2 layers of combustible material, the inner layer comprising insulation and the outer layer comprising some form of rain screen, which, as the name implies, is intended to screen the insulation against the effects of inclement weather. It follows that the key component of such a wall construction was the insulation, the purpose of which was to maximize energy efficiency, the importance of which in the current energy crisis is all the more obvious than it has ever been before. But for the use of the insulation, there would have been no call for any form of rain screen. As to the type of insulation, this was discussed by Mr. Evans of the NHBC, who explained that at the material time, there was a focus on thermal insulation. It was, he said, a big drive of the government as part of the carbon agenda, and they wanted ever more thermally efficient wall makeups. Builders were finding that the only way that they could achieve this was with insulation which was not material of limited combustibility. Similarly, in response to a query from Sweden, Brian Martin stated that requirements for thermal insulation put greater pressure on designers to use polymer insulation materials, which tended to be lighter and to provide greater insulation value than non-combustible alternatives. As regards the external rain screen cladding, there is ample evidence that this too was in regular use for many years before the fire. I'll consider later in this section of our submissions the extent to which this was facilitated by the then applicable regulatory regime. At this point, I merely observe that if ACMPE was in widespread use, it must follow that those charged with the building control function believe that its use was permissible. It's simply inconceivable that building control officers up and down the country were as weak and as lacking in competence as, with all respect, we saw in the case of the RBKC building control function at Grenfell Tower. Moreover, as we pointed out in our Phase 1 written closing, Professor Bisbee himself, in his Phase 1 report, acknowledged that PE materials were known to be highly combustible, something which in his oral evidence in Phase 1 he also confirmed. The use of ACMPE was moreover confirmed by Mr. Evans of the NHBC, which had a significant involvement in building control. Although Mr. Evans claimed to believe that the use of ACMP was not permitted by the regulatory regime, something that I will address a little later, he did acknowledge that there was a high number of buildings out there with PE core, something that was in effect confirmed by Mr. Evans' colleague John Lewis, who in his witness statement stated that at the end of 13 he knew anecdotally of projects where NHBC provided warranty or building control, where the external wall arrangement specified a combustible material in buildings which were over 18 metres. It is, in any event, likely that this was the case, given the publication by the NHBC in July 2016 of their guidance, which approved the use of ACM panels on facades, providing that such panels were of minimum Class B and which provided a Class 0 spread of flame. It's worth adding, incidentally, that this guidance also stipulated for reliable cavity barriers around window and door openings to reduce the likelihood of fire entering the cavities at these points, and likewise such reliable cavity barriers at compartment lines to restrict the unseen spread within the wall build-up. It follows that the AAP, the Arconic BBA certificate, contains stipulations very similar to those contained in the NHBC guidance. Similar evidence emerges from the powerful comments by Mr. Jenkins of Booth Murie at the Siderise BRE Facade Conference in January 2016, who stated that in many instances his company was asked to supply standard polyethylene core ACM material. He added that there were many tall residential buildings recently constructed in the UK where such panels had been installed in combination with various foil-faced rigid foam insulation boards which were not of limited combustibility. The inquiry will be aware that we have submitted from an early stage that the market share of the company which we represent, AAP SAS, was in the UK comparatively small, and there's certainly no evidence to the contrary. For present purposes, however, the point is not that the supply of ACMPE by that company was rare, but that the supply of ACMPE was not. A number of questions were posed by the inquiry to witnesses as to the reasons why combustible materials were in such widespread use. Unsurprisingly, perhaps, the answer to this question took, broadly speaking, one of two forms. Some witnesses questioned the degree of use and claimed that they were unaware that the use was so widespread. But in the light of the evidence which I've already mentioned, this response lacks plausibility. Other witnesses claimed that they did not believe that the use of combustible material was in conformity with the contemporary regulatory regime. Again, for reasons which I will come to, this response lacks plausibility. It is, of course, easy to understand why, following the Grenfell fire, witnesses should wish to distance themselves from matters in this way, either to deny that combustible materials were in widespread use, or to claim that their use ought to have been precluded by the contemporary regime. However, it seems from a strategic view of the evidence that the Grenfell Tower fire was not the only reason why witnesses were incentivized to close their eyes to what was in front of them. The true reason is because, as awareness of the situation developed even before the Grenfell fire, no one was willing to face up to the legacy issue, namely the problem that all parties were to face in dealing with the legacy of buildings clad with combustible materials, if and when it should be decided that that was no longer a safe method of construction to employ. And you may recall that Mr. Metcalfe of the CWCT was asked whether it was true that nobody had acknowledged since 2006 that there had been what Council called a 10-year legacy of misunderstanding by the UK construction industry with unknown life safety implications. He gave no satisfactory response. Now, the same kind of analysis can be applied not only to the question of the use of ACMPE, but as to whether it could have been used in a way which was potentially compliant with the regulatory regime, or at least could have been used in a way which was believed by reasonable people in the marketplace to be usable in that way. But this would seem to be the inevitable conclusion from the examination of witnesses in Module 6. The point was often put on the basis of a lack of clarity, but it seems to us very clear that there was in fact simply no requirement in relation to the rain screen to be of limited combustibility. And indeed, the approach of your own counsel has been that the regime permitted the choice of a material by reference to its surface alone rather than its core. If this was an approach which could have been taken in good faith by a UK supplier, then that must have been all the more true in the case of a non-UK supplier. For the purpose of developing this line of reasoning, it seems to us necessary to begin by observing that the evidence has identified a number of different concepts relevant to the assessment of fire performance. Some, but not all of these concepts, are actually listed in the inquiry's own fact sheet for Module 6. As we know, and as was emphasised by Mr. Bird, the regulatory regime did not involve banning products as such, but rather made provision for the control of use to make sure that products could be used safely to meet the functional requirements. It should, of course, also be stressed that the ultimate functional requirement was to achieve adequate resistance to fire, and specific requirements such as the linear route, to which I'll be making reference, were intended to represent methods of potential compliance with the ultimate requirement. So dealing in turn with 2 or 3 relevant concepts and referring first to class 0, this is, as it happens, identified as follows in the inquiry's fact sheet. It's described as a notional product performance classification for lining materials defined in approved document B, which can be achieved either by a product being comprised throughout of material of limited combustibility or by meeting certain requirements when tested in accordance with BS 476 and BS 476 Part 6 and BS 476 Part 7. In our submission, some at least of the criticism directed to the use of class 0 as a test has been unfounded, being based upon the assumption that the test was intended to apply or could have been applied in a much broader way than was ever realistic, thus being a test which was at any rate primarily to ascertain the way in which a flame would spread across the surface of a product. The test manifestly could not be relied upon in order to reveal wider aspects of fire performance, such wider aspects being discussed further below. Moreover, being a test of a product and not a system, the test by definition could not have enabled a designer to specify a particular product without also considering the system in which it was to be deployed. We certainly submit that there can be no possible criticism of a product manufacturer in seeking to obtain, by appropriate means, a Class 0 certification. By virtue of the reference to Class 0 in paragraph 12.6 of approved document B, National Class 0 was one component, and only one component, of the linear route to compliance. A product manufacturer supplying a product with a Class 0 certification would not be confirming and could not be taken to be confirming that the linear route had been satisfied. Whether the linear route had been satisfied would be a matter for wider consideration in the context of paragraphs 12.5 to 12.9 of approved document B, taken as a whole. We suggest that in most, if not all cases, the extent to which a particular facade design would have achieved compliance with the linear route was necessarily a matter for expert advice and input, and the requirements for such advice was obvious simply from a perusal of those paragraphs. No one involved in refurbishment works to which the linear route might apply could properly or legitimately claim to have believed that a Class 0 certification enabled a product to be used in any particular cladding system, irrespective of the other components in the system or the configuration in which they were to be deployed. The point has repeatedly been made in the course of submissions and evidence that Class 0 was in itself an inadequate test for the purposes of fully assessing fire performance, a proposition which could perhaps be described as a glimpse of the blindingly obvious. If by reason of the language in approved document B, or for any other reason, contractors or others involved in building work were relying on Class 0 for purposes beyond those for which it was properly intended, then that is an approach, the fallacy of which simply cannot be laid at the door of an individual product manufacturer, let alone one operating from overseas. Plainly, the issue is a matter for those involved in the design and implementation of a refurbishment project, and also for government and other official bodies and individuals involved in the regulatory process. The point can be made and has been made that in each of these categories, individuals manifestly ought to have been aware of the limitations of Class 0 as a method of assessment and of the extent to which Class 0 was being relied upon in an inappropriate manner. The next concept that I'd like to mention is the notion of a test of reaction to fire. The inquiry fact sheet lists a number of European reaction to fire tests, including the single burning item test, EN 13823, and the single flame source test, EN 11925. It's important to understand that the EN 13823 test does involve the testing of a product in a particular system. The fact sheet states that a reaction to fire test is used to determine the extent to which products and materials contribute to the early stages of a fire before it reaches flashover. It's to be noted that Dr. Smith accepted and testified that the BRE and government went forward with the retention of Class 0 and or Class B, knowing that some Class 0 products might achieve a European class significantly inferior to Class B, but would nevertheless be allowed on a UK building above 18 metres. It does seem clear that the European reaction to fire tests provide a somewhat sounder basis than Class 0 for the assessment of the fire performance of cladding materials, though necessarily with some limitations. In particular, it needs to be stressed once again that an individual product manufacturer cannot carry responsibility for the significance attached by the approved document to the outcome of a reaction to fire test. If and to the extent that reliance upon European Class B was insufficient as a method of assessment or as a component in the linear route, then the responsibility for this must lie at the door of government or at the door of those involved in any particular project who failed to take sufficient expert advice. The third concept which deserves consideration in this present context is that of resistance to fire, which relates to a later point in time than the early stages of a fire and concerns the extent to which a particular element in the system, or indeed the system as a whole, will resist the penetration or spread of fire. This is, of course, a highly relevant concept in the context of the functional requirement of the building regulations themselves, namely adequate resistance to fire. It seems clear that the preferred method of testing in relation to this issue was full-scale testing pursuant to BS 8414. The inquiry will, I'm sure, well recall that in the company's BBA certificate and in many others, those using its products were expressly informed that the certificate gave no assurance as regards resistance to fire, and that this would have to be the subject of separate tests. The inquiry may take the view that it may have seemed perfectly reasonable for different approaches to be applied to the insulation on one hand and the rain screen cladding, whose solitary function was to protect externally the insulation on the other. There was an explicit requirement for the insulation itself to be of limited combustibility. If that requirement was complied with, then it would perhaps be understandable if the view were taken that the rain screen cladding need achieve no higher standard than National Class 0. It certainly cannot have been an accident that the two approaches, as to insulation in paragraph 12.7 and as to the rain screen in paragraph 12.6, were different. Mr. Martin acknowledged that the suggestion that paragraph 12.7 was intended to include all materials in the external wall would leave diagram 40 and paragraph 12.6 as empty of content. Many of the witnesses, of course, sought inappropriately to take advantage of what they claimed was their understanding of the requirement in paragraph 12.7 of approved document B, requiring the insulation to be of limited combustibility. It submitted nonetheless that all attempts to suggest that paragraph 12.7 applied in any form or in any way to the rain screen cladding were and are doomed to failure. There was a clear consensus at the CWCT meetings in 2014 and 2016 that the reference to filler in paragraph 12.7 could not, certainly not without further exegesis, be taken to include a reference to the combustible core of a composite product. Mr. Martin conceded that his department did not confirm in writing until after the Grenfell fire that the words filler material were intended to have that application. Once again, the point is reinforced that this awareness of the significance of the word filler could not possibly have been achieved at any material time by an overseas product manufacturer. It's worth noting that the question whether the external walls of a building needed to be fire resisting specifically arose for decision at the Lakanal House inquest as a result of an expert witness called David Walker having suggested that this was the case. Brian Martin, you may recall, was accordingly called to give definitive evidence of the official position on this issue, which was accepted by the coroner. In this connection, the transcript of the evidence of Mr. Martin at the Lakanal House inquest is worthy of close attention, and we have the full transcript. See in particular the passage, it's on page 35, where Mr. Martin confirms that generally the main surface of a building could be expected to be class 0. He goes on to state that class 0 is the most restrictive of all the classes, the most stringent, short of non-combustible. He accepts that class 0 was designed to prevent fire on the exterior of a building fire, travelling from floor to floor in a way that makes it difficult to deal with from a fire authority's point of view. Finally, he states that class 0 material will burn, just not very much. None of this seemed controversial at the time, certainly not to the various parties at the inquest, some of whom are represented here before you today. By contrast, the use of combustible insulation was plainly directly contrary to the requirement of ADB paragraph 12.7. This meant that anyone proposing combustible insulation but wishing actually to comply with the regulatory regime at the time would have needed to recruit a facade expert or to carry out a full-scale test of the proposed facade under BS 8414. And if this step had been taken, and it's a point we've made before, if this step had been taken, the facade would clearly have been designed and presumably the design implemented in a completely different way. From a causative point of view, the fact that no one involved in the project insisted on taking expert advice in the face of this manifest breach of the regulatory regime is probably the most significant of all the failures with which the inquiry will be concerned. The truth is that for many years, policymakers and regulators did not see the use of combustible rain screen panel in general, and of ACMPE in particular, as particularly problematic or risky. This is a realization which was understandably and dramatically enhanced by the Grenfell Tower fire itself. Until then, the concern in terms of fire performance focused principally on the insulation and the need for that component to be of limited combustibility. And one might mention in this context the fact that Professor Bisbee, no less, in his report dated the 10th of November 2021, at paragraphs 1360 and 1443, expressly acknowledges his own failure to highlight, prior to the Grenfell fire, any potential problem with the way in which the regulatory regime handled the supply of the ACM product. To the extent that policymakers and regulators did consider other and wider factors apart from the insulation, the better view was deemed to be that alongside the nature of the insulation, it was necessary to take a holistic view of the combination of materials and of the way in which they were configured in the cladding system as a whole. Dr. Raymond Connolly, in his 1994 report, Investigation of the Behaviour of External Cladding Systems in Fire, Report 10, after defining the term fire hazard, stated as follows: in assessing the fire hazard, it was found that the design, detailing and construction of the complete cladding system is more important than the reaction to fire properties of the individual materials involved. Consequently, it is suggested that the fire hazard be determined by testing the complete cladding system as in practice. Given Dr. Connolly's reputation and standing, it's also worth emphasising that in 2015, he felt able to provide advice for building control purposes, approving the use of ACMPE in connection with the Apex building in Ealing. Although the proposal was not approved by the NHBC, it was ultimately approved for building control purposes by the London Borough of Ealing. According to the NHB witness, John Lewis, Dr. Connolly provided a long and detailed report concluding that the cladding did not pose a risk. Moreover, in his statement to the inquiry, Dr. Connolly confirmed his agreement with the House of Commons committee that a full-scale fire test should be required as the sole measure for demonstrating compliance with Part B4. But importantly, he also stated, and this, as I say, is in his statement to the inquiry as recently as last December, that the wholesale prohibition of combustible cladding was not required. Now, I move, if I may, to make some brief comments under my second heading before moving to my third and final heading. My second heading, you'll recall, concerned the supply of ACM PE by Arconic, AAP SAS, the company which we represent. It is, of course, for the purpose of this aspect of the closing, all the more important to stress to the inquiry that this company should be judged not with hindsight, but on the basis of what they knew or ought to have known at the time. Thus, for example, a topic to which we refer briefly in this closing concerns previous fires, particularly overseas, whether in France or in other jurisdictions such as the Middle East or Australia. The present position is that the inquiry has seen relatively little fully detailed analysis of the facade build-up or of the actual causes of overseas fires. And the point is now reinforced by the evidence in Module 6 that there was a widespread failure, possibly in some instances deliberate, or so it's been alleged, on the part of those in the know, including those in government and indeed those having professional expertise, to make known to the public at large, including the construction industry generally, the full facts which their experimentation and expertise were undoubtedly bringing to light. One might add that not only did this company lack much of the information now disclosed to the inquiry, but it's also the case that unlike some of the other suppliers, they made no attempt to bring about pressure on UK regulators or others to encourage an interpretation of the regulatory regime which was favourable to them. We do recognise that it's been suggested that those in the industry should have been put on notice by recent overseas fires of the issues which arose at Grenfell. However, it is perhaps easy to be misled as to the potential relevance or impact of these overseas fires. In the first place, so far as the evidence goes, their wider impact was to some degree limited in that the market may have been persuaded that if a severe fire took place at height, this could have been due to a variety of causes and that one could not simply assume that inapt materials were utilised. Secondly, and in any event, it seems at least as likely that the history of overseas fires was on balance reassuring, in that the very limited loss of life was perceived as confirming the adequacy of regulatory regime. A product manufacturer, especially in another jurisdiction, cannot be taken to have known of the domestic stay put policy with its attendant implications for life safety. Of course, we acknowledge that views such as those I've been discussing have now been severely criticised as manifesting undue complacency, but the evidence is nonetheless clear that these were views widely held at the time. Now I want to go on to my third and final heading, the supply and use of ACMPE and other products at Grenfell Tower. This is not the place, obviously, to rehearse fully the submissions we made in our Module 2 closings, written and oral. But since Module 6 is concerned with testing and certification, there are some points in relation to testing and certification of the products used at Grenfell Tower to which we wish to refer. We acknowledge that the inquiry has scrutinised closely the tests carried out on behalf of this company, AAP, and we emphasise that these tests were undertaken by an authoritative testing body in France, namely the CSTB. We remind you that the BBA certificate was a product certificate relating to an ACM panel, and in common with other BBA certificates, did not distinguish between the performance which might be achieved once the panel had been fabricated, whether for fixing by rivets or as a cassette. In my oral submissions to you on the 14th of September 2021, I made the point that two or more EN, European classification reports, can coexist in relation to the same product at the same time. Each report shows the classification which the tested product was capable of achieving in the tested system. One such report in 2011 showed a B classification for the product when fabricated as rivet. and that report expressly shows that it remained valid until 2016. Later on the same day, in the course of his oral closing on behalf of Celotex, their counsel claimed that Arconic had cancelled the Class B certifications that it had previously obtained for Rainabond PE, and that there was therefore no Class B classification in existence at the time that Rainabond was sold for use at Grenfell Tower. In our Module 6 written closing, as I'm sure you've seen, we have responded in detail to this allegation and showed that there was, in fact, a valid Class B certificate for the riveted version, granted in 2011 and therefore still valid in 2016. A further criticism has been the failure of the company to report to the BBA the outcome of the cassette testing in 2005. Without reiterating the full content of our previous submissions on this topic, we would remind the inquiry of the central point that the BBA certificate could not and did not claim that the product in question, namely the ACMPE panel, would achieve an ENB result in any and every system and in any and every configuration. We have repeatedly pointed out that approved document B itself makes this very point in Appendix A in the following terms, in something called Note 2. Any test evidence used to substantiate the fire resistance rating of a construction should be carefully checked to ensure that it demonstrates compliance, that it's adequate and applicable to the intended use. Small differences in detail, such as the fixing method, joints, dimensions, and the introduction of insulation material, etc., may significantly affect the rating. That is an explicit requirement of the whole scheme with which we are dealing. And I'd just like to add, on a separate matter, reference to the steps taken by the company from early 2014 onwards to make clear to the market the wider testing picture, particularly with regard to cassette. We deal with that in our Module 2 written closing, particularly at paragraphs 144 to 152. Now I'm moving towards the conclusion of these submissions, but I have a few further points to make. There is a further argument arising, dealt with in greater detail in our written closing, arising from the testing carried out, or perhaps rather not carried out, in the course of the preparations for the refurbishment of Grenfell Tower. We repeat that a failure to undertake a holistic fire assessment was of crucial causative significance. There is, however, a narrower but also powerful point relating to the role of Harley, who purchased the ACMPE from the fabricator's CEP and who were responsible for the way in which it was installed. From their submissions to the inquiry, it would seem that Harley regard perusal of the Class 0 certification on the front page of the BBA certificate as representing a fulfillment of their responsibilities. Nothing could be further, of course, from the truth, not least because of their manifest obligation to consider the BBA certificate in its entirety. In addition, disclosure by the inquiry, mainly I think after the end of Module 2, has revealed that Harley knew or ought to have known a great deal about the performance in practice of ACMPE and about the conditions under which it would perform. They, among others, ought clearly to have taken into account this information in deciding on the suitability of ACMPE as opposed to a fire retardant alternative in the context of Grenfell Tower, or the need, at any rate, to seek holistic fire engineering advice. And I mention in that context the evidence of Mr. Sakila on the 5th of May 2021, who made clear that there was a duty on those involved in construction work to consider the nature of the materials specified, irrespective of any warnings which might or might not be given by suppliers, and indeed, where appropriate, to make specific inquiries of the suppliers if there was any doubt about the suitability of particular materials. Now, I want to deal with an argument strongly advanced on behalf of Kingspan Insulation, who in this module, but based on the Module 7 evidence, assert that the use of combustible insulation had no causative significance at Grenfell Tower. For this striking proposition, they rely upon the experiments by Professor Bisbee and Professor Torero. This argument is one to which it may, of course, be necessary to return in the context of submissions about Module 7. But it is appropriate in this presentation to make the point that the argument is wholly flawed for a separate and independent reason. I've already stressed the fundamental point that the use of combustible insulation at Grenfell Tower, being inconsistent with the linear route to compliance and with the clear regulatory stipulation in ADB paragraph 12.7, ought to have led those concerned with the refurbishment project to carry out some form of holistic fire engineering assessment or to commission such an assessment from those with suitable expertise. If that had been done, it's clear that the combination of materials used at Grenfell Tower would never have been approved and the tragedy would never have occurred. However, the argument advanced on behalf of Kingspan overlooks the fact that the conduct of Kingspan and of Celotex as the suppliers of the insulation was a critical element in the failure of all those concerned to carry out that necessary holistic assessment. As Ms. Barwise pointed out in section 6 of her module 2 written closing, Kingspan and Celotex both made representation to the effect that their product was suitable for use above 18 meters, and thereby expressly or by implication gave reassurance that paragraph 12.7 was satisfied, seeking successfully as it transpired to give a green light to others as to the appropriate use of such products via the linear route without holistic testing or assessment. Now I want to make just a few further brief comments arising primarily from steps taken in relation to testing after the fire and related matters. Regrettably, as we respectfully submit following the fire, the focus throughout has been on the ACMPE panels supplied by this company, though the majority of those panels, as we have previously sought to stress, albeit supplied by AAP, were fabricated and utilized in ways that could not possibly have been foreseen by them, for example, on the crown and on the columns. Testing was then carried out by the BRE, which itself was of unproven reliability and in configurations which bore little resemblance to the tower. We also contend, with great respect, that perhaps too little emphasis in phase 2 has been placed so far on the fact that at least as regards the start of the fire in the cladding system, there were many other causes equally or more potent than the ACMPE panel. Of these, among the most significant, as we submit, were the failure to introduce suitable non-combustible barriers around the windows and indeed in the cavity itself, which at the very least would potentially have delayed the onset and spread of the fire, and spread of the cladding fire, with consequential advantages in terms of success of the intervention by the London Fire Brigade. Equally significant at a later stage were the failures of compartmentation, both internal and external, which led to the fire re-entering and spreading internally to a far greater extent than in any of the overseas or indeed domestic examples of previous fire. What happened at Grenfell was truly a perfect storm in which the ACM PE panels were but one component of the maelstrom. We urge the inquiry to continue to take an objective view of all these matters and not to allow itself, as unfortunately Mr. Martin at one point did, to limit its focus to the role of the ACM, suggesting as he did that if one were to remediate building defects more widely, the population of the United Kingdom would be living in tents, something that he said in an email that you've seen. Nor, we are confident, will the inquiry follow the advice of whichever nameless official it was, and again quoted in an email that you've seen, who commented that the loss of a particular company involved in the Grenfell Tower refurbishment would not be severe. So that concludes my oral presentation, and I'm grateful to you and your colleagues for your patience.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Hockman, for delivering those remarks and for delivering them so clearly. And I'm sorry you weren't able to be here in person, but you haven't lost out in any way as a result. So thank you very much. Now, we are due to take our morning break at 11:30. You finished slightly ahead of time, for which we're grateful. What we'll do, therefore, is to break now. We'll resume at 20 to 12 if the next speaker, who is going to be Mr. Green, Queen's Counsel, on behalf of Kingspan, is available 5 minutes earlier than scheduled. If he's not available until 11:45, then we'll resume then. So thank you very much. The next statement we're going to hear will be made by Mr. Tim Green, Queen's Counsel, on behalf of Kingspan. Mr. Green is going to make it remotely, and I'm very pleased to say that I can see you, Mr. Green. Can you see me or us?
I can see you, sir. Are you able to hear me, sir?
Yes, we are. Thank you very much indeed. So thank you for making yourself available a little earlier than scheduled. That's very helpful. And we're ready to hear your statement if you'd like to carry on.
Thank you very much, sir. Mr. Chairman, Ms. Estefan, Mr. Agbor, these submissions focus on two aspects of the inquiry's stated objectives for Module 6, namely examining the functional requirements of the building regulations and considering the government's handling of issues raised in relation to fire safety. Kingspan Insulation sincerely hopes that this inquiry's examination of these important issues will help to bring about real improvements in the regulatory regime going forward. The Grenfell Tower fire was a tragedy that should never have happened, and it is vital that the necessary reforms are now made to the regulatory regime so that there is no possibility of such unsafe cladding systems being constructed in the future. These submissions divide then into 6 parts. Firstly, some important initial points of context. Secondly, I'll highlight just one of the many failures on the part of the government, namely the failure to act on the information it held about the risks posed by PE Cord ACM. Thirdly, the dangers still posed today by the regulatory regime in relation to the linear route to compliance. Fourth, the position of Kingspan Insulation in relation to certain assertions advanced during Module 6. Fifthly, the importance of reviewing the Module 6 evidence in the light of the expert evidence now provided. And lastly, a few words by way of conclusion. Some initial points of context then, please. Given that witnesses were questioned in Module 6 about Kingspan Insulation K15 product, it is right that I start by reiterating certain points. Kingspan Insulation had no direct involvement in the refurbishment of Grenfell Tower. It played no role in the design or installation of the cladding system. It provided no advice or technical guidance to those responsible for the design of the refurbishment or its installation. It had no contractual relationship with the council or the TMO or any of the designers or any of the contractors engaged on the refurbishment. It did not provide any products directly to those involved in the refurbishment. It was not informed that its K15 phenolic insulation product was being used on the tower at the time of the refurbishment, and it was not aware that K15 had been used on the tower until after the fire. In total, only about 5% of the rain screen insulation purchased for use on Grenfell Tower was K15. The second introductory point that I would ask the inquiry to keep in mind is that it is now clear beyond any doubt that the nature and speed of the spread of the Grenfell Tower fire was caused by the presence of Arconic's Rainobond PE Cord ACM cladding. Last week, the inquiry heard the evidence of the experts, Professor Bisbee and Torero. Their evidence was absolutely clear on this issue. Professor Bisbee explained that one of the reasons why PE Cord ACM cladding was, in his words, so dangerous is because of its very volatile behaviour. His conclusion was simple: don't use it. Don't use PE Cord ACM, whether in cassette form or riveted or otherwise. Why not? Again, the answer is very simple. In his words, it has a core of polyethylene, unmodified polyethylene, that will burn a lot. It has the potential to cause, in his words, a very big fire. 1 year ago, in Kingspan Insulation's closing submissions for Module 2, on the 28th of June, we said this: any rain screen insulation, including non-combustible insulation, will play some part in a cladding fire, not least because its insulating properties act to retain heat from combustion of the cladding system. On the basis of the extensive modelling carried out by Effectus, we also said this at paragraph 12 of those submissions: the nature and speed of the spread of the fire across the exterior of the tower was a result of the PE Cord ACM cladding and would not have been materially different if non-combustible insulation had been used. Last week, Professor Bisbee reported on his experiments. Those experiments confirmed the points we made a year ago. It is the capacity of insulation to retain heat which is relevant in cladding fires involving PA called ACM, and not whether that insulation is combustible or non-combustible. And Professor Bisbee's experience also showed that the speed and spread of the fire over the PE called ACM cladding was materially the same whether that cladding was combined with combustible insulation or non-combustible insulation. Professor Bisbee's conclusions are entirely consistent with the peer-reviewed published papers by Effectus. Any rain screen cladding product sold for use in the UK must take into account the reality that it will be used in conjunction with insulation, given the need, underpinned by regulatory requirements, for effective insulation on buildings. This means that the cladding must be designed to be capable of withstanding the heat that is inevitably retained in the system by insulation in the event of a fire. It is clear that Arconic's PE called ACM cladding was not safe for use in a rain screen cladding system with either combustible or non-combustible insulation. From a regulatory perspective, there are significant questions as to A, how and why the regulatory regime failed to prevent PE called ACM from being marketed as suitable for use, given that it was so dangerous, and how and why the regulatory regime failed to prevent PE called ACM from being used on Grenfell Tower. Those, in our submission, are key questions which need to be answered as part of this Module 6 analysis. Secondly, the failure of the government to act on the information it held about the risks posed by PE called ACM. The starting point for this analysis is the remarkable fact that large-scale testing undertaken by the BRE for the government in 2001 had shown that PE called ACM was unsafe when used in combination with non-combustible insulation. Dr. Cowell's evidence was that she was shocked by the 2001 PE ACM test, which failed, in her words, extremely rapidly. She was, she said, shocked at the speed it took off. The test had to be manually terminated very early at 5 minutes and 45 seconds because it was such a significant fire. This was notwithstanding the fact that the PE ACM tested had achieved Class 0 certification. In light of that test, Dr. Cowell concluded that PE called ACM was not an appropriate product for use for external cladding of high-rise buildings. Those government tests demonstrated precisely the failure mechanism which later resulted in the Grenfell Tower fire, namely the failure of the aluminium skin exposing the polyethylene core, which then burned. Professor Bisbee said that he was left speechless when he learned of these government tests carried out in 2001 and reported in 2002. Prior to the Grenfell Tower fire, there was very little, if any, information available in the public domain about any large-scale testing involving PE called ACM. But it is now clear that the government was in possession of such information, and for whatever reason, it was not published and not acted upon. In 2017, following the Grenfell Tower fire, the government carried out large-scale testing of two systems comprising PE called ACM with combustible PIR insulation and non-combustible mineral fibre insulation. The conclusion of the independent expert panel following those tests was this: ACM cladding with unmodified polyethylene filler prevents a significant fire hazard on residential buildings at any height with any form of insulation. What is so shocking is that precisely the same conclusion could and should have been drawn by the government 15 years earlier when it received the 2002 BRE report in respect to the 2001 PE called ACM test. The regulatory regime could and should have been amended at that stage to prevent the use of such PE called ACM cladding on tall buildings. The 2001 test of a system using PE called ACM was never published by the government. At paragraph 47 of its written closings, the Department for Levelling Up Housing and Communities accepts that research commissioned and funded by public monies should be published. It expresses regret that the report of the 2001 test was not published. It describes this as an oversight. In the event, no action whatsoever seems to have been taken in light of the 2001 test commissioned by the government. It is one of a number of issues of key importance that appears to have been missed by officials acting for the department. Leaving aside the failings of individuals for a moment, what does this tell us about the regulatory regime? How and why were steps not taken at any stage between 2002 and 2015 to ensure that the regulatory regime precluded the use of PE cord ACM cladding in light of the knowledge acquired by the government from its own tests? The obvious answer is that the system in place failed to even recognise the importance of the test data held by the government, or the importance of the multiple other reports of concerns about PE cord ACM. Part of the reason for this failure is that no emphasis was placed by the regulatory regime or by the relevant government department on the need for test data to be collated and shared transparently, even in respect of the data held by the government. Another part of the reason for the failure may have been over-reliance by the government on individual product testing, rather than a proper appreciation of the value of large-scale system testing. Nor was there any real appreciation of the need to amend ADB to deal with the risks so clearly posed by PE cord ACM. The risk enclosing submissions of the Department of Levelling Up Housing and Communities accept, as they must, a series of crucial failings on their behalf, including the failure to recognise the extent of the risk posed by PE cord ACM despite multiple warnings over a period of years. The department also states that it deeply regrets that the gravity of the risk posed by PE cord ACM cladding was not appreciated, even when this was expressly raised in the CWCT meeting on the 2nd of July. See paragraph 97 of the department's submissions. In addition, the department also accepts that it failed to keep ADB up to date or address known ambiguities, including the term filler in paragraph 12.7. There are multiple lessons to be learned here, as the government recognises. Apart from anything else, there needs to be a reliable system for the collation and sharing of large-scale test data on which the government, the regulatory authorities, and appropriately qualified professionals can rely. Thirdly, the dangers still posed today by the regulatory regime in relation to the linear routes to compliance. The government's failings in respect to the regulatory regime do not end with past mistakes in respect to PE cord ACM. The linear route to compliance provided by approved document B was flawed back in 2015, and we submit remains flawed today. In 2015, the linear route was based on small-scale testing of individual products. It did not expressly require any consideration to be given as to how products will perform when used together in a system. That same fundamental weakness in respect to the linear route to compliance remains today. It is still possible for a cladding system to be deemed to comply with the linear route based on small-scale testing of individual components, when in fact the system would fail a large-scale BS 8414 test. This is a point which has now been made by Professor Bisbee at paragraph 326 of his report on desktop studies. He says this, that it is conceivable that an external wall arrangement that abides by the recommendation of ADB's linear route might even fail to meet the requirements of BR135 if tested to BS 8414. Professor Torero made a related point very simply when he said, so you can have a perfectly non-combustible material that is an extreme hazard because it deforms and breaks apart very rapidly. As the inquiry knows, there are documented examples of A1 and A2 systems failing when tested to BS 8414. Kingspan Insulation has provided the inquiry with 5 systems which have failed to meet BR135 criteria when tested to BS 8414, even though they would have been permitted under the linear route because they comprise only A1 non-combustible and A2 insulation and cladding products. Those examples are set out in paragraph 145 of our written closing submissions in phase 2 to module 2. It's not clear to us whether Professors Bisbee and Torero have been provided with copies of those 5 system tests, But they do illustrate very clearly the point that they are now making and the point that Kingspan Insulation has been making for many years. Kingspan Insulation witnesses were heavily criticised during the course of Module 2 for the fact that Kingspan Insulation had drawn the Parliamentary Select Committee's attention to this point in 2018. The validity of the point Kingspan Insulation was making is now clearly accepted by Professors Bisbee and Torero, and it's hoped its importance will now be accepted by the inquiry. It remains unclear to Kingspan Insulation whether the inquiry has sought disclosure from the BRE or other test houses as to whether they hold test data relating to other large-scale tests of systems comprising A1 or A2 insulation and cladding, which would be deemed to comply with the linear route, but which have failed when tested to BS 8414. We do, however, invite the inquiry to try to collate information relating to any such tests from test houses and make any such data publicly available. The failure of the government to publish the BRE's 2001 PE Cord ACM test was a very significant mistake, and it's hoped the inquiry will now play an important role in ensuring that test data relevant to systems comprising A1 and A2 insulation and cladding and the linear route to compliance are now made publicly available. Such data are likely to assist informed decision making in respect to the risks inherent in the linear routes to compliance. The inquiry has now seen that Brian Martin accepted in emails back in 2013 that he never expected the linear route to result in a system that would always pass the BR135 criteria. Professor Bisbee explains at paragraph 333 of his desktop assessment report that he believes that it is self-evident that a system which complies with the linear route could still fail to meet the requirements of BR135 classification when tested to BS 8414. He observes that the linear route has the potential to mislead incompetent designers into thinking that they have met requirement B4 of the building regulations. In contrast, Dr. Cowell of the BRE considered it, in her words, an extraordinary proposition to suggest that a system which complied with the linear route might not be expected to pass BR135 criteria. A regulatory system is clearly not fit for purpose if its unstated assumptions are not clear to even highly specialist and competent professionals, such as Dr. Cowell, with years of relevant experience. Just as the government knew that PE Cord ACM systems were dangerous back in 2002 and did nothing about that fact, so it is clear that the government now knows that the linear route to compliance is not fit for purpose. The government's reaction to the Grenfell Tower fire was to ban the use of combustible products over 18 metres. That decision was taken without the benefit of the expert evidence now obtained by this inquiry and without a full understanding of the unintended consequences. These issues are not simple. The evidence of Professors Bisbee and Torero demonstrates the complexities of cladding systems. As both Professor Bisbee and Torero have made clear, cladding systems must not be looked at as merely a collection of independent products with assumptions being made as to how they will perform together. Simple, intuitive assumptions like combustible products must be unsafe and non-combustible must be safe do not work. Professor Bisbee explained at paragraph 17 of his Phase 2 experiments work package 2 that, in his words, the experiments presented in this report have highlighted the immense complexity of the heat transfer environment within a ventilated rain screen cladding cavity. This suggests that an intuitive understanding of the factors that govern fire initiation, growth, and spread in such situations can very easily lead to false or incorrect assertions. The fact that these issues are not intuitive matters reinforces the need for a truly scientific approach to be taken to the safety of cladding systems. As Professor Torero has correctly stated, banning combustible materials will not solve the problem. That merely provides a false sense of security. Professor Torero described an ideal system where material properties were measured and used by competent professionals to model facade performance in the context of a chosen fire safety strategy. He espoused the use of large-scale system testing, for example, testing to BS 8414, to provide additional data and model validation as part of this process. Kingspan Insulation agrees with this approach. It is clear from the evidence heard by this inquiry that BS 8414 testing has not been perfect in the past, but the fact that the BS 8414 test is not perfect does not mean that large-scale system testing should be abandoned. Rather, the focus should be on improving the testing to ensure that it captures more data, which can then be used to greater effect. It is submitted that proper use of computational fluid dynamics, or CFD for short, should be part of the modelling approach. Professor Terrero recognises the advantages of CFD modelling, albeit that it must be undertaken by very competent professionals. Improvements such as scrutiny of the testing process by regulators would also help to prevent abuse of the system. Fourthly, the position of Kingspan Insulation in relation to certain assertions advanced in Module 6. Kingspan Insulation has accepted that there have been shortcomings in the past in respect to the testing and certification of its K15 insulation. It has identified those shortcomings and apologised for them in its Module 2 opening and closing statements. Issues concerning the testing and certification of K15 were explored again in Module 6 for the purpose of considering the failings on the part of others who were involved in the relevant testing and certification processes, including the BRE, LABC, the NHBC and the BBA. Some of the questions put to witnesses from those organisations have sought to suggest that Kingspan Insulation may somehow have placed improper pressure on or had some form of improper dealings with those independent bodies. Such allegations were denied on multiple occasions by various witnesses from those organisations. Kingspan Insulation's position on these allegations is very clear. At no time did it have any improper dealings with any of these bodies, within respect of testing, certification, guidance notes, or otherwise. It's worth saying a word about Arconic's current position. It's clear from their written and their oral submissions today that even now they do not accept they were at fault for selling a cladding product which was so very dangerous. We note that at paragraph 76 of their written submissions, it suggested, yet again, that K15 manufactured after 2005 was somehow more flammable than the K15 that was tested in 2005. As we have repeatedly said, that assertion is not based on any scientific evidence and it is not true. The allegation appears to rely largely on the December 2007 test of a SOTEC system which failed with K15. But that same system failed in January 2008 with non-combustible mineral fibre. These two tests must be seen together. The failures were due to the thermomechanical properties of the A1 aluminium cassette cladding system, rather than the type of insulation. The 2008 test is one of the 5 examples that Kingspan Insulation has provided of a system which would comply with the linear route, but nevertheless fails when subjected to a large-scale test. In their oral closing submissions on Monday, the BSR Team 1 suggested, again, that Kingspan Insulation was somehow responsible for the use of any and all combustible materials at height. This apparently stems from K15 being the first combustible insulation to be part of a system that passed a BS 8414 test. This assertion is without merit. Kingspan Insulation has never promoted the use of combustible materials generally. It promoted its own K15 insulation following a BS 8414 test in 2005 of a cladding system which incorporated K15. And there have been 14 other cladding systems incorporating the type of K15 used on Grenfell Tower which have passed BS 8414 tests since. Kingspan Insulation is not responsible for the different products produced by other manufacturers. It was also suggested on Monday that Kingspan Insulation had lobbied for the widening of TGN 18 by the BCA. There was no evidence cited for this assertion. It is an assertion which is incorrect and wholly unsupported by any evidence. In addition, there was an allegation on Monday that Mr. Nick Jenkins had somehow assisted Kingspan Insulation to manipulate the outcome of a building safety programme test. This is completely incorrect. There was no manipulation of this programme by either Kingspan Insulation or Mr. Jenkins. Fifthly, the importance of reviewing the Module 6 evidence in light of the expert evidence now provided. Kingspan Insulation has set out in its written submissions the issues which it considers ought to have been subject to greater scrutiny in Module 6. These include the extent of the problems which still remain in respect to the regulatory regime and the potential dangers still posed by the linear route to compliance. However, it is submitted that the service of the latest expert evidence of Professors Torero and Bisbee has been a watershed moment in this inquiry. Those reports drill down into many of the critical issues concerning both the true causes of the speed and spread of the Grenfell Tower fire, as well as the weaknesses, past and present, of the regulatory regime. We would invite the panel to revisit the Phase 2 evidence, particularly the Module 6 evidence, in the light of the crucially important evidence now given by these two experts. Our concluding remarks. Ultimately, Arconic must bear responsibility for the fact that its Roanoke Bond PE cord ACM product was unsafe and unfit for use as rain screen cladding in combination with either combustible or non-combustible insulation. However, the government must also bear its share responsibility. The government knew about the dangers posed by PE cord ACM cladding since at least 2002 and did nothing to prevent its use. The objective of the regulatory regime is to achieve safe buildings. The regulatory system should have prevented the use of unsafe PE cord ACM, not permitted it under the linear route without any large-scale testing. It is apparent that the regulatory regime was unfit for purpose at the time of the Grenfell Tower refurbishment in 2015. Kingspan Insulation's position is that it still remains unfit for purpose today. The linear route to compliance is not the way forward, nor are inappropriate blanket bans. Rather, the regulatory regime must be founded on a properly scientific approach so as to ensure that only safe cladding systems are built in the future. Only those with proper competence should be responsible for assessing the safety of individual designs. The evidence of Professors Torero and Bisbee over the last 2 weeks has been enormously helpful in clarifying many of the problems and potential solutions. Their evidence is warmly welcomed. Kingspan Insulation will make further submissions in respect of recommendations for improvements to the regulatory regime in due course and in accordance with the timetable set by the inquiry. Thank you for your patience, sir.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Green. That's very helpful. Finally, this morning, we're going to hear a closing statement by Sam Leek, Queen's Counsel, on behalf of the Building Research Establishment. And Ms. Leek is going to address us remotely as well. So, good morning, Ms. Leek. I can see you. Can you see us?
I can, thank you, sir. Can you hear me?
We can hear you, thank you, and I hope you can hear us as well.
Thank you.
Thank you for making yourself available a little bit sooner than we had suggested in the timetable, but that's all to the good. We're ready to hear you if you'd like to make your statement. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. So first of all, BRE again would like publicly to recognise the courage and determination of all of the bereaved survivors and residents who have been involved in the hearing process, knowing that for many, this will have been a painful and distressing experience. On behalf of BRE, I would like to offer heartfelt condolences to all who have been affected by the fire and its aftermath. Throughout this module of Phase 2 of the inquiry, BRE and its legal team have attended many days of hearings in person and remotely, and have observed counsel to the inquiry's probing forensic examination of more than 30 years of work carried out by public authorities and private organisations, which touches the regulation of cladding systems in the UK. This is the first time that there has been such comprehensive and intense scrutiny on that subject. As an organisation which has worked to improve the built environment and to ensure the health and safety of those who use it, BRE welcomes this scrutiny. BRE has cooperated fully with the inquiry to provide evidence on matters within its knowledge and which concern its own work for government and private entities. As the evidence was heard, it became apparent that BRE's role in the regulatory system has been misunderstood by others, including stakeholders working in the building industry, and the inquiry's expert, Professor Luke Bisbee. The same misunderstanding was apparent from questions posed by counsel to the inquiry. BRE is not the department, and its role is not akin to that of the department. So today I will address the following topics, all of which are dealt with in more detail in our written closings. First, the correct analysis of BRE's role. Second, the regulatory system applicable to the external walls of buildings, including cladding systems, and BRE's role in it, or lack thereof. Third, BRE's specific research projects for government, as raised by counsel to the inquiry in questions to BRE witnesses. Fourth, an accurate summary of BRE's knowledge and steps taken about three particular issues addressed in evidence by counsel to the inquiry: industry confusion about the meaning of ADB, use of ACMPE on high-rise buildings in the UK, and Kingspan's misleading claims about its K15 product. Fifth, the department's knowledge from other sources, and sixth, UCAS's assessment of BRE last year. First of all, BRE's role. It is correct that BRE used to be an executive agency within the Department of the Environment. That link with government ceased 25 years ago in 1997 when BRE was privatised. BRE then became a group of companies owned by an independent charitable trust. When it was privatised, BRE ceased to be funded by government. It became an independent, self-funding body, generating income and receipts from its activities through contractual arrangements for the supply of services. Clients include government departments, other public bodies, and private sector customers. The parameters of BRE's work and obligations, whether for public or private sector clients, are defined by contract and regulatory requirements. BRE companies are obliged to fulfill their contractual and regulatory obligations and to maintain client confidentiality. Profits are used to serve wider society for the public benefit or are invested internally to make improvements at BRE. In the last 20 years, BRE Trust has funded over £20 million of research for the public benefit, produced or updated over 300 publications, and supported more than 300 postgraduate students through its university partnerships. BRE's structure and its history under government control, afford it no regulatory function nor any special status. Those who believe that BRE has a function or a status that changes its duties from those of a private entity to those of a public authority are misguided. BRE is not a part of government. It is not a public authority. It is not publicly funded. It is not a regulator, as acknowledged by Mr. Seward and Ms. Barwise, Queen's Counsel, on Monday. BRE does not have any other status to oversee what is placed into the built environment. BRE does not draft building regulations nor approve documents. Some core participants still appear to misunderstand BRE's role. By way of example, it is not correct that BRE's Dr. Sarah Colwell, and I quote, wrote the book together with the department's Brian Martin, as was suggested by BSR Team 2 in their opening and closing submissions for this module. It is not correct that BRE were involved in drafting approved document B and were therefore very familiar with its content, as was wrongly stated by an employee of Wintec in a witness statement. It is not correct that BRE was advising government of necessary changes to the provisions in clauses 12.5 to 12.9 of Approved Document B 2006, as Professor Bisbee wrongly stated in his Phase 2 report. It is not correct that it fell to BRE to provide clarification on ADB, as the industry body CWCT wrongly stated in a witness statement. And it is not correct that BRE's role was to advise government on ADB, as the Mayor of London wrongly stated in his written closing. Each of those misapprehensions suggests that BRE has a role in the regulatory system akin to the department or a government-appointed regulator. It does not. BRE now understands that questions put to its witnesses under Rule 9 and orally perhaps laboured under the same misapprehensions about BRE's role. The work of BRE companies primarily covers two core areas: testing and research. This work, carried out under commercial contract with public and private bodies, is quite different from the work of the department or a regulator. Commercial work of these types is carried out by other companies in the building industry, who, like BRE, are engaged under contract. In its testing function, BRE carries out UCAS-accredited testing, classification, and certification of construction products for manufacturers to the standards set by government and regulatory bodies. BRE companies have no unique regulatory status from being a testing house. Those wanting testing services are free to use other commercial testing houses, such as Warrington Fire. UCAS-accredited testing houses are specifically required not to disclose test sponsors' confidential information. This regulatory requirement of confidentiality is, in turn, contained in contracts between BRE and test sponsors. In its research function, BRE undertakes independent research on behalf of its customers, whether the commissioning client be a government department or a profit-making company. Again, BRE has no special regulatory status as a result of undertaking that research. Government contracts are let through a competitive tender process. BRE is under no obligation to bid for or to accept a government contract, and government is under no obligation to engage BRE. The objectives, assumptions, scope, and budget of a research project are set by the contract, which are the parameters within which BRE must operate when delivering the contract. The product of the contract is owned by the commissioning client, who may use it or not to fulfill their objectives. As with other commercial arrangements, it is not open to BRE to disseminate information in breach of confidentiality. Second, the regulatory system and BRE's role in it, or the lack thereof. So in order for the regulatory system to be scrutinised and BRE's role within it to be properly understood, it is crucial that the inquiry and participants in it accurately understand that system and the role of different entities within it. At a very basic level, there are 6 layers of documents in the regulatory system for external walls on high-rise residential buildings. First, the Building Act 1984 being statute passed by Parliament. BRE has no part in drafting statute. Second, building regulations, which the Secretary of State of the Department has power to make pursuant to the Building Act. The Secretary of State is advised by the Building Regulations Advisory Committee, or BRAC, on the exercise of the power to make building regulations. The building regulations contain functional requirements, as you know. For cladding systems, the relevant functional requirement is functional requirement B4, which applies to external walls. BRE has no statutory role in drafting building regulations. Further, no BRE employee sat on BRAC when the 2010 building regulations were drafted. Third, Approved Document B, which the Secretary of State has power to issue pursuant to the Building Act. BRAC is the statutory advisory body to be consulted on amendments to approved documents. Approved Document B records, among other things, the Secretary of State's view on how functional requirement B4 can be complied with. BRE has no statutory role in drafting approved document B. And again, no BRE employees sat on BRAC when approved document B 2006 was drafted. Fourth, BR 135 was a document produced by BRE in 1988 when it was part of government, and which has since been updated. It became part of the regulatory system, having been incorporated into approved document B by the Secretary of State. The Secretary of State and BRAC remained responsible for determining whether and how to use BR 135 in the regulatory system for external walls. BR 135, being a part of the regulatory system, does not somehow make BRE a regulator, nor responsible for that regulatory system. Fifth, BS 8414 Parts 1 and 2 are BSI documents based on BRE's Fire Note 9 of 1999. BS 8414 Parts 1 and 2 were incorporated into ADB by the Secretary of State. The Secretary of State and BRAC remained responsible for determining whether and how to use Fire Note 9 and then the 8414 documents in the regulatory system for external walls. Again, this does not somehow make the RE a regulator or responsible for that regulatory system. And 6, building control completion certificates. Local authority building control have the statutory power and duty to give such a certificate when building work is deemed to comply with the applicable functional requirements. BRE does not issue completion certificates. BRE has no status to provide an interpretation of building regulations or approved documents that might inform whether a local authority gives a completion certificate. Whereas other entities such as the Building Control Alliance or the National House Building Council may issue guidance on the meaning of building regulations or approved documents to assist local authority building control, BRE does not do so. BRE's work may inform a building control officer's decision in a narrow and distinct way. BRE as a testing house can be contracted to carry out a test on a cladding system to one of the BS 8414 methods. If test data meet the criteria in BR 135, BRE may issue a test report and a classification report to evidence that the specific cladding system is classified to BR 135. That classification report may then be relied upon by a local authority when exercising its power to give a completion certificate. For the avoidance of doubt, BRE was not engaged to and therefore did not test the cladding systems installed onto Grenfell Tower prior to their installation. Nor did BRE issue a BR 135 classification for the cladding systems issued onto the tower, installed onto the tower. No testing house did. It has become apparent in this inquiry that regulatory failure occurred prior to the fire at Grenfell Tower. The cladding systems fitted onto Grenfell Tower should have been subjected to a BS 8414 test before even being considered for the refurbishment project. Those cladding systems never would have passed a BS 841 test and therefore never would have been classified to BR 135. Had those cladding systems been directed down the appropriate route to compliance with building regulations, being 135 classification, they would not have been fitted onto Grenfell Tower and would not have been signed off by building control by way of a completion certificate. As the inquiry's expert, Professor Bisbee, said last week in his oral evidence, if you test ACM PE on an 8414 test, I defy you to pass that test. BRE had no role in setting or interpreting the regulations which should have clearly directed specifiers of those cladding systems to BR 135, nor in applying or enforcing the regulatory regime by giving a completion certificate or otherwise. It has become apparent in this inquiry that ADB 2006 was unclear, that specifiers lacked competence to interpret ADB in a way that met functional requirement B4, and that Building Control 2 lacked competence to interpret ADB in a way that met functional requirement B4. Participants in the inquiry who believed that it was BRE's role, instead of or in parallel with the department, to uncover or address those regulatory failures do not understand the role of BRE. Third, BRE's specific research projects for government, as discussed in evidence with counsel to the inquiry. Evidence in this module, and as summarised in BRE's written closing submissions, covers BRE's contracts with government over nearly 3 decades. We refer you to those written submissions for fuller detail. BRE's research for the department, time and time again, provided the department with the knowledge that, first of all, Class 0 alone is an inadequate predictor of tolerable fire spread across cladding systems. And second, that full-scale testing was the only method which could satisfactorily assess the performance of cladding systems. That knowledge ought to have resulted in the department formulating a regulatory system which was intelligible to stakeholders, that prohibited the use of ACMPE on the external walls of high-rise residential buildings. It was not BRE's role to formulate that regulatory system. It was for the department to do so. It was for the department to act on objective data and technical conclusions provided by BRE, and on information provided by others, if it so chose, in line with its policy objectives. I will now address briefly 4 specific projects undertaken for the department that were discussed with counsel to the inquiry. First, pre-privatisation in the mid-90s, when cladding systems were first emerging in the UK building industry, BRE's Dr. Raymond Connolly conducted a series of tests for the department. From the test results, Dr. Connolly concluded that cladding material achieving Class 0 rating may suffer extensive burning, and there is a clear need for full-scale testing of performance in fire. That research project unequivocally informed the department more than 20 years prior to the tragic fire at Grenfell Tower that Class 0 alone is an inadequate predictor of tolerable fire spread across cladding systems, and that full-scale testing should be used to assess the safety of cladding systems. Second, as a consequence of Dr. Connolly's findings, in 1998, the recently privatised BRE produced for the department Fire Note 3. Fire Note 3 reflected the full-scale test method recommended by Dr. Connolly. Fire Note 3 was succeeded by Fire Note 9, which, as I have already stated, was succeeded by the BS 8414 test methods. As a result of BRE's research, the department had been provided with a solution to the concerns raised by BRE's Dr. Connolly about the emerging use of cladding systems. It was for the department to decide whether to cite Fire Note 9 in approved document B, and if so, how, including whether to excise a linear route to compliance in favour of mandatory full-scale testing. Third, Contract 1924 dating between 1999 and 2002, also known as CC 1924, has been much discussed in this module. It is important to understand the true and contractual purpose of CC 1924 and the significance of the work product. CC 1924 was to produce data to input into the drafting of a new version of BR 135. The data were to be used and were used to set the criteria in BR 135 so as to exclude cladding systems whose combination of materials displayed intolerable fire spread. The contract achieved that objective. As scientists do, BRE presented objective data and technical conclusions to the department, not emotive language. BRE's technical conclusions included the following, and I quote, "The aluminium sheet product satisfied Class 0 requirements, but in the full-scale, intermediate scale, and single burning item test, proved to be one of the worst performing products. And the full-scale test was the only method which satisfactorily assessed the system performance, including detailing such as fire barriers." Again, BRE's test data and technical conclusions inform the department that first, Class 0 alone is an inadequate predictor of tolerable fire spread across a cladding system, and second, that full-scale testing was the only method that satisfactorily assessed tolerable fire spread. As a consequence of CC 1924, BR 135 was updated. The process of updating was by the formation of an industry advisory group, which consulted with BSI technical committees FSH 21 and 22. Prior to publication, BR 135 2003 was agreed by the department. BRE's witnesses' evidence was that BRE 135 precludes the use of ACMPE in a cladding system, as a system that incorporates ACMPE will not meet the BR 135 criteria. It was for the department, equipped with BRE's data and conclusions, to ensure that those types of cladding systems were directed down the BR 135 route to compliance, which could prevent them from being put into the built environment. If the department's policy choice favoured a different outcome, or if its policy was to achieve that outcome but it was poorly executed in ADB, the responsibility for that does not lie with BRE. BRE's witnesses were asked why they did not warn industry about the dangers of ACMPE as a result of CC 1924. BR 135 was the published warning to industry not to use ACMPE, as a cladding system containing it would fail to meet the BR 135 criteria. BRE had provided the department with the knowledge and means effectively to ban ACMPE. That was precisely the point of CC 1924. Fourth, the investigation of real fires programme was also much discussed between BRE's witnesses and counsel to the inquiry, and its work product has been criticised by the inquiry's expert, Professor Bisbee. These criticisms are misplaced. The investigation of real fires programme must not be equated with BRE having powers to investigate fires as a regulator. BRE had and has no such remit or powers. The programme was a contractual research project, with the product belonging to the department for use or not as it saw fit. It operated on a limited budget, with the department setting criteria for the types of fire that were to be investigated. The department was aware of the constraints placed on the IRF programme by its budget. BRE's written closing submissions for this module detail how BRE raised the issue of those constraints with the department. See in particular paragraph 70 and footnote 53. More significant fires were escalated by BRE's production of fires of special interest reports. I now turn to a few notable example reports produced under the IRF programme. First of all, Garnet Court. CTI asked BRE's witnesses about BRE's report for the department on the fire at Garnet Court in '99. BRE entirely rejects the suggestion that text was malignly deleted from this report when compared to BRE's reports for Irvine Council. That suggestion is groundless and was rejected by BRE's witnesses and the departments alike. The first paragraph of the report expressly states that it is a simplified version of a report prepared for Irvine Council. Further, the report for the department expressly referred the department to the Select Committee's earlier report on that fire. The Select Committee had reported concerns about the adequacy of Class 0 as a predictor of tolerable fire spread across cladding systems, citing BRE's Dr. Connolly's work and recording that there is a clear need for full-scale testing. The department was, again, presented with BRE's technical conclusions about Class 0 and large-scale testing, about which BRE reminded the department in its report on Garnet Court. It was for the department to act. BRE notes that Professor Bisbee, having suggested in his Phase 2 report that information was removed from the Garnet Court report, retracted that suggestion in his oral evidence, preferring the explanation that mention of Class 0 was not necessary anymore. Transcript day 290, section 195, lines 1 to 5. The Edge Building. CTI also asked BRE's witnesses about their reports for the department on the fire at the Edge Building in 2005. In a Fires of Special Interest report, BRE expressly raised with the department the potential for ADB to be read, rightly or wrongly, as allowing combustible material in a cladding framework without a BR 135 classification. As acknowledged by Ms. Barwise, Queen's Counsel, on Monday, this report amounted to, and I quote, a clear warning from Martin, Colwell and Greenwood, all then at BRE, that the provisions of Section 12 of ADB governing external fire spread were insufficiently clear. It was for the department to remedy that concern, or not, as it saw fit. Lakanal House. BRE's witnesses were asked about reports for the department on the fire at Lakanal House in 2009. BRE produced a first draft Fires of Special Interest report for the department 13 days after the fire. It was then instructed by the department to cease investigating this fire. BRE had no obligation or authority to continue investigating. Separately, BRE was contracted by the Metropolitan Police Service and the London Fire Brigade to investigate this fire for a different purpose. The contract expressly excluded investigations that pertained to building regulations. Criticisms about the content of BRE's reports for the department, the police, and the fire brigade failed to understand the contractual nature of BRE's work and the parameters set. BRE had no authority, remit, or funding to investigate matters outside of how it was contracted. BRE's investigation of real fire reports from 2001 until 2015 contained, as you have heard, a generic statement as follows. The findings from this period have reaffirmed the overall, and I underline overall, effectiveness of the building regulations and ADB. It was put to BRE's witnesses that this generic statement was false. BRE says as follows. First, this statement must be read against the common understanding between BRE and the department that approved document B required most components of an external wall to be of limited combustibility unless the cladding system had been classified to BL 135. Second, this statement must be read with the underlying assumption that professionals can be expected to act with competence and integrity. It is wholly unrealistic to suggest that BRE ought to have predicted that people in the building industry, from architects to manufacturers and industry bodies to building control, would adopt an interpretation of ADB that failed to meet functional requirement B4. Third, where a specific fire gave rise to a concern about how building regulations and ADB had been applied in the built environment, BRE drew that concern to the department's attention. The Edge fire is an example, as already discussed. Finally, as detailed in BRE's written closing submissions for this module, the statement was accurate. As Dr. Crowder put it in his oral evidence, the statement communicated that BRE, at that time, did not see a need for a total rewrite of building regulations and ADB. As he said, it doesn't indicate a fundamental problem and a fundamental need to go back to the drawing board, but this was followed up with then specific recommendations. So the inquiry is invited to consider that the real problem, in hindsight, at that time, was with compliance. As Professor Bisbee said, ACMPE panels would never have passed 8414. Fourth, BRE's knowledge and steps taken by BRE. This part of BRE's oral closing will cover BRE's employees' knowledge in relation to 3 specific issues raised by CTI. Industry confusion about the meaning of ADB, the use of ACMPE on high-rise buildings in the UK, and Kingspan's misleading claims about its K15 combustible insulation board. BRE must be judged against its actual, not perceived or assumed role within the building industry and against factually accurate findings, not assumptions, about what BRE's employees knew. BRE's position is that the department was in possession of the relevant information concerning confusion about the meaning of ADB and of the risks of ACMPE to a greater degree and or earlier than BRE. BRE's position is that it, BRE, acted appropriately when information about industry practice was provided to it. So I expand briefly as follows. First, with regard to industry confusion about the meaning of ADB, as detailed in BRE's written closing submissions, BRE's employees became aware of this confusion in or around October 2013, when BRE was contacted by TRESPA. BRE's Tony Baker then raised the matter with the department the following month. This was the appropriate thing to do, as approved document B is the department's document. The department, not BRE, had the authority to act. Second, with regard to the use of ACMPE on high-rise buildings in the UK, as detailed in BRE's written closing submissions, it was in January or February 2016 when BRE first became aware when Nick Jenkins of Booth Newry raised the matter. In February 2016, Dr. Sarah Colwell referred Mr. Jenkins to the department. Again, this was the appropriate thing to do, as the department regulates the industry. Again, it was for the department, not BRE, which had the authority and the responsibility to act. Third, with regard to Kingspan's misleading claims about its K15 insulation board, certain misrepresentations were made about a BS 8414 test report that BRE had produced for Kingspan. BRE acted to stop misrepresentations about this BRE document. First, when in 2006, Kingspan issued a misleading flyer entitled "What's Lurking Behind Your Facade?" BRE complained to Kingspan, after which the flyer was removed. Second, BRE informed BBA that its certificate in respect of K15 wrongly represented that K15 itself satisfied ADB. In both those instances, BRE acted appropriately. Suggestions were put to BRE's witnesses that BRE should have done more. First, actively to uncover regulatory failure, and second, to address regulatory failure when BRE employees learnt about issues in the industry. These suggestions mistake BRE's role for that of the department. It was simply not open to, let alone advisable for, BRE to start acting as if it had regulatory powers. Suggestions were made that after CC 1924, BRE ought to have warned the industry about the dangers of ACMPE. These suggestions misstate both BRE employees' knowledge about the use of ACMPE and misunderstand the scope, purpose, and the significance of the outputs of the contract for competent professionals. Suggestions were made that the investigation of real fires programme ought to have surveyed existing building stock for ACMPE. Again, these suggestions misstate both BRE employees' knowledge about the use of ACMPE and, more fundamentally, misunderstand the scope and purpose of the contract. Suggestions were made that the investigation of Real Fires programme ought to have investigated the fires at Taplow House and Sudbury House and downward fire spread at Lakanal House. These suggestions, again, misunderstand the scope and purpose of the contract. As I have said, BRE is not a regulator and it has no investigatory powers. FAQ, frequently asked questions. Misunderstandings in the industry about BRE's role have been further evidenced by Dr. Sarah Colwell being asked to draft an FAQ to address confusion about the meaning of ADB. As you will recall, she was asked to do so in July 2014 at a CWCT meeting. Earlier, I addressed CWCT's misunderstanding about BRE's role as stated in a witness statement before this inquiry. BRE's Dr. Sarah Colwell accepted that she did not raise the matter of an FAQ with Brian Martin after the CWCT meeting, although the evidence is that she had already suggested an FAQ to Mr. Martin prior to that meeting. In reality, Dr. Colwell's error was to engage with any suggestion that an FAQ would originate from BRE. Dr. Debbie Smith's evidence was that she was puzzled by Dr. Colwell's agreeing to help with an FAQ as, and I quote, "It's not BRE's role to write the guidance directly, nor to interpret the guidance." Dr. Debbie Smith's statement about BRE's role is correct. Fifth, the department's knowledge from other sources. It is clear from the evidence heard in this module that the department was aware of the following. First, paragraphs 12.5 to 12.7 of ADB 2006 were being interpreted differently from BRE's interpretation and what BRE understands to have been the department's interpretation. Second, industry was interpreting those paragraphs in a way that failed to protect against the risks of intolerable fire spread identified by BRE's Dr. Connolly's report in 1994 and by BRE's experimental programme under CC 1924 in 2002. Third, ACMPE was in fact being used on high-rise residential buildings in the UK. And fourth, combustible insulation boards were also in fact being used on high-rise residential buildings in the UK without any technical basis for doing so. It is evident that the department was aware of these matters at least as early as BRE was, and to a greater degree, yet was unwilling or unable to act. Brian Martin's oral evidence to the inquiry was plain that in the period after the CWCT meeting of July 2014, he was not going to act on the information available to him. His view was that guidance from industry bodies was the appropriate way to disseminate a stricter interpretation of paragraphs 12.5 to 12.7 of ADB 2006 version. Mr. Martin stated that the department relied on the recently published BCA Technical Guidance Note 18, Issue 0 of June 2014, and the NHBC communication entitled The Use of Combustible Materials Within the External Wall Construction of Buildings Over 18 metres in Height, which attached BCA Note 18, as he said, as a way of flagging the BCA guidance note to NHBC members, which is nearly every house builder in the country. His evidence was that this would be a more effective means of ensuring widespread readership than an FAQ on the department's website. There was nothing material that BRE could tell the department that the department did not already know. As already stated, BRE time and time again informed the department that class naught is an inadequate predictor of tolerable fire spread across cladding systems, and that full-scale testing was the only method which could satisfactorily assess cladding systems' performance. Upon learning that specifiers of cladding systems and building control were interpreting ADB differently, perhaps so as to rely on class naught alone in lieu of BR135 classification, it was for the department to act. Sixth, UCAS's assessment of BRE in May 2021. BRE is mindful of the evidence in Phase 2, Module 2 of this inquiry, UCAS's consequent assessment of BRE in May 2021, and UCAS's evidence in that regard in this module. It is acknowledged that UCAS identified certain improvements required in BRE's quality management systems for the purpose of ISO accreditation, but, and BRE emphasises, that there is no evidence that any such issues impacted on BRE's test results. The UCAS reporting process included discussions with testing personnel who were expressly recognised by UCAS as being competent, well-trained, and who correctly carried out test procedures. BRE reiterates that UCAS raised no concern about BRE's conduct of BS 8414 tests. Indeed, UCAS concluded that there was no obvious indication of any testing having been performed incorrectly. BRE also wishes to reiterate that the concerns raised by UCAS are in no way connected with the fire at Grenfell Tower. Like many organisations, BRE constantly seeks to improve the quality of its work and internal processes. BRE continues to seek improvements based on learning from this inquiry and from UCAS assessments. So, in conclusion, the inquiry determined in Phase 1 that the cladding systems put onto Grenfell Tower should never have been signed off by building control at the Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea, and could never have met functional requirement B4 of Building Regulations 2010. The evidence seen and heard in this module has disclosed that prior to the tragic fire at Grenfell Tower, paragraphs 12.5 to 12.9 of ADB 2006 were interpreted by industry stakeholders in a manner that failed to accord with functional requirement B4. BRE has addressed in these closing submissions other misunderstandings on the part of industry stakeholders concerning BRE's role in the industry and detailed its true role. BRE did not draft ADB. BRE does not have any other status to oversee what is placed in the built environment. And where BRE heard concerns, it passed them on to the appropriate authority. BRE's research data and technical conclusions demonstrated time and again to the department that class naught alone was an inadequate predictor of tolerable fire spread, and that full-scale testing was the only method which could satisfactorily assess cladding systems performance. Professor Bisbee's evidence on 9th of June 22 likewise leads to the conclusion that cladding materials must be tested as part of a system in a large-scale test. This has been known since BRE's Dr. Connolly's work in the 1990s. The evidence before the inquiry in this module has revealed regulatory failure in the years leading up to the fire at Grenfell Tower. Participants in the inquiry and those in industry who believed that it was BRE's role, instead of or in parallel with the department, to address that regulatory failure, do not understand the role of BRE. Finally, BRE hopes that the examination of practices, policies, and regulations will contribute to the public understanding as to how unsafe cladding systems came to be signed off on Grenfell Tower and other buildings. BRE proposes to provide written submissions setting out changes to its own practices and its proposals for recommendations. As was stated at the conclusion of Module 2, BRE is committed to learning whatever lessons for the future can be learned from this inquiry, and to playing its part in the strengthened building safety regime. The inquiry's report and recommendations will be analysed carefully, and the lessons learned will be shared within the organisation and beyond to ensure continued organisational development and improvement in this critically important area of building practice. Thank you, sir.
Well, thank you very much, Ms. Leek. That brings us to a close for this morning, and we shall now rise and sit again at 2 o'clock when we shall hear a closing statement on behalf of the Local Authority Building Control from Mr. Adamson, Queen's Counsel, but that'll be at 2 o'clock. Thank you very much. 2 o'clock, please.